tech.
So
Cool.
Carrie is gonna it'll take her a minute to.
Yep.
I just let her know we're good to go.
Cool.
It'll take her a second to get that up
Okay.
and running. So everyone has mics in front of you. I muted them for you or do you want me to unmute them in case people have a question?
You just tap the button
Yeah.
and it will turn green at the neck, and then you're good to go.
Yeah. Just so that we can capture it, folks are gonna be live streaming, and also we wanna make the recording available to everyone later,
Yeah.
so.
Cool. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, she said stand by. She's working on
Okay.
it, so it takes a second.
So where are you presenting? Right there, here?
She's good.
Or who's
Allie is our
presenting?
expert. We're the host.
Oh,
She's
but-
getting trained with you.
Yep, pretty much.
okay.
All right, so we are good
Cool.
to go. All right.
All right.
But I will stand by the microphone.
Yes.
So I'm Kirsten Ness. I am the Education Outreach Coordinator here at Portland Water District, and we are partnering with Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District to deliver our TroutKids program. So that's why we are both here. So hopefully that doesn't get too confusing. But we have had some staff turnover here at the district in terms of our education staff. So we are contracting our education out to these wonderful folks. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll take it from there.
Cool. Hi, I'm Allie Clift. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator at the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District. And I do now a lot of the behind the scenes work to make all of this function for Chris Lowe, who's going to actually be in the classroom with some of you, or helping coordinate your release or your supplies, other things that you might need. So 90% of your interactions are going to be with Chris, and then Chris is going to be like, hey, this teacher needs something, and then I'll be like, got it, and then that's how that's going to work. So Chris, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris Lowe. I'm the one that's been sending you guys all those emails, so I'm sorry about all that. But I'm glad you guys are here. Yeah, I'm going to be the one that's going to be fielding questions that you guys may have, any kind of concerns you may have through this whole process. And if there's anything that we can do on our end to help you guys' experience with raising the trout, please reach out and let us know. But the hope for tonight was that you guys walk out of here feeling more comfortable raising trout. But if you ever have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So.
Right. And Chris will be assisting some of you with like your field trip release or in the classroom lessons, possibly dropping off the eggs to you. So there are a lot of steps that we'll go through together for this. However, the reason I'm here is because I'm the only person between the three of us who's actually done a trout unit. So I'm gonna be training Chris as we go along. And be supporting from that end as well. But the first thing that I want to talk about is the TroutKids unit. And so Portland Water District has a version, the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District has a version. They're pretty much identical, except for Portland Water District's is gauged for 6th grade specifically, and ours flexes for other age groups. The TroutKids unit is available on Google Drive. So Portland Water District has a Google Drive that if you have not already been given access to, just let us know and we will share the link with you, because that's going to have 90% of the resources that we're going to be talking about today. So within that Google Drive, there are a series of lessons that go really, really well with raising trout in your classroom. And then there are other resources, materials that other teachers have created as they've been doing a trout lesson that they found useful. So feel free to explore those folders, and if you see things you like, just download them, and then if you need to make edits or modifications, feel free to do them on the local version on your computer. So the lessons that we recommend that kind of accompany the trout tank are the healthy water lesson, which covers kind of the key water quality parameters that students need to know. So like temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, clarity, algae, those types of things.
Is it in here?
No, so these are all online because the lesson packets, if we had printed those out, would be like reams of paper. So we decided to save a couple trees for that. But then the water worries lesson is a lesson that goes really well because that talks about all of the potential water pollutants that would then mess with those water quality parameters and make it worse or harder for trout to survive in that body of water. A big picture lesson that could work really well depending on kind of the other concepts that you're trying to cover with this would be what's a watershed, which is a lesson that big picture talks about how water drains from the land and kind of ends up in that stream, lake, pond, or wherever your trout are going. Then there's benthic bugs, which you can do as a classroom lesson. And there are pictures and like classroom supplies that are classroom friendly, so you can do them in the wintertime and not chip through ice to try to find macros in the stream. So you can do that, or you can save the macros lesson to when you're doing the field trip release with the trout, and you can survey for macros right there in the stream, or you can do both. So you can kind of prep the students with pictures and a macro lesson in the classroom beforehand, and then when they get to the actual site and they're looking at them in person, they already kind of have some reference and some background information to support that. And then the last lesson is Swim for Your Life, and that lesson, it covers the trout life cycle and then the probability of your trout surviving in its habitat. So it talks about all of the like pressures that a trout would have at its different life stages to kind of survive to adult. So that is a good lesson to talk about both its life cycle and also its habitat. So you can kind of do that lesson at the beginning of this unit, or you can kind of do it at the end, or you can kind of do it at the beginning and then come back to it at the end once the students are like way more keyed into everything. So those are the lessons that kind of go really well with this. There are, of course, tons and tons of other lessons that you can find online that you might have from other resources that would go really well with this. We just wanted to make you aware of the fact that these lessons exist and are available for you. Another resource that we have is on my district's YouTube channel, so the Soil and Water Conservation District. We have a video of the hatchery. So you can show, it's like a 10-minute video of our staff going and interviewing the hatchery staff and footage of the actual hatchery. And so you can kind of use that video to show the students like the day or two before, or like the day that the eggs are there, kind of like where they came from and some background information like that. So if that's of interest, we can make that link available for you as well. All right, so those are kind of the key classroom components that go with this trout unit. And then for the trout tank itself, there are obviously lots of components for the actual tank, but the key things that you want to do at least once a week, if not daily, is to have the students check on the tank. And that check can be rather intensive or it can be fairly light. So this sheet of paper has an example of like what you might want your students to run through kind of on a daily or a weekly basis. So in the step 1 box where it's the equipment check, those are things that you want to kind of check fairly frequently just to make sure your tank is functioning properly and that your trout eggs aren't gonna have any difficulties. The water quality testing, you definitely wanna check the water temperature, but pH and ammonia are optional unless you know that your school water quality is not great, or if you really want your students to be practicing that water chemistry. The mortalities section, that's something that you just want to keep an eye on so that if you see an egg die, you remove it from the tank so it doesn't start to mold and infect the other eggs. And you do want to kind of keep track of how many eggs you've lost, but for the most part, that's just kind of cleaning your tank. And then you can also have them do like a data sheet that goes along with this, or you can have them record this information in a science journal, notebook, whatever. Some teachers do this as like a daily prompt or like something that they do at the start of class, or you can do it kind of as like the beginning of the week. You always do these checks, or the end of the week, or middle of the week, and just have that. Some teachers also will have this, they'll take a couple eggs, or once the eggs hatch, they'll take some of the alvin out and put it in a beaker and have the students do a quick sketch of like the development that they can observe. And you can kind of add that to this tank inspection process. And then I'll talk about the code of conduct a little bit later. So, are there any questions about kind of how the students interact, or like what the students are getting out of this so far? Okay, cool. Then let's talk about how to assemble your tank.
Oh, wait, I have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
What do you mean by expose trout to natural light for a maximum of 15 minutes?
Yes, okay, so during part of the trout's development stage, they would naturally be on the bed of the stream. They might even be buried under gravel, and so they would not be getting a whole lot of exposed light because of the season, with us not getting a lot of sunlight to begin with, and then also them being covered. So that's, the insulation does two roles for your tank. One helps keep it so the chiller's not working overtime and your tank is always going to be the temperature that you want it, but it also blocks out light. And so if you want to take some of the eggs out or some of the fish out for the students to do an observation, then you want to make sure that they're not sitting in that beaker for more than 15 minutes. You want to kind of take them out, put them in the beaker, have the students do a quick observation, and then put them back in the tank and make sure that they're covered back up again. Does that make sense? No?
Okay, so you want me to
Okay.
take them out
Yes.
for 15 minutes at least a
Or
day?
less.
Or less.
Or less.
Okay, what if you have, okay, got it.
So that means if you have multiple classes during the day, you want to try to pull eggs from this corner for one class, this corner for one, or like this area for another class, this corner for another class. Try to make sure you're not grabbing the same ones. I know it's hard to keep track of because they all look the same, but like try to at least grab from a couple other places. Once they start swimming around, it's not as big of an issue. It's mostly when they're in the egg stage.
That per day or week?
So that's per day. So the other thing is if you have a lot of classes, you can kind of stagger it. So like your first block always sees or does their observation on Mondays. Second block always sees it on Tuesdays, etc. Something like that.
But you're not saying like that's a requirement?
No.
Expose them to light. It's just
No.
like if you do take them out.
Right. Try to minimize the amount of light exposure they have. Yes. All right. So for your tank assembly, before you get your trout, there are some things that you want to do. So if you already have a tank in your classroom, you want to, one, make sure that you have all of the pieces that you need, which for a tank setup, you want to make sure that you have your chiller. You want to make sure that you have a dip net of some kind, a thermometer that is accurate. Then you want to make sure that you have all pieces of your insulation that you hopefully still have pre-cut and everything's nice. So you want to have a top piece, 2 side pieces, a back piece, a front piece, and a piece on the bottom. And if any of your pieces are in really poor shape, then you might want to try to replace them, get a new one, make a repair, etc. Then you also want to make sure that your filter has all of the pieces that it needs. So you need to have 2, well, depending on the type of filter you have, if it's like a double like this one, you want to have 2 of these round filters, and then 2 of these blue square ones that are kind of like Brita filters because they have little charcoal in them. And then if these are the filters from last year, you want to chuck them and get fresh ones. The filters that you have will last like your whole trout unit, but occasionally you're going to want to take them out and kind of dunk them in a bucket of water that you've had acclimating, so it's not like fresh out of the taps. It's one that has evaporated off any chemicals, anything like that, and just take them out and just kind of swish them around, and then just put them back in. So those are the pieces of your filter, and then this part. And then your chiller, you want to make sure that everything looks right, nothing's bent or like anything like that, because then it most likely will not work. And you want to make sure that it still has its temperature probe on the side. All right, so once you make sure that you have all of your pieces, the other thing is if you have a filter that looks like this but it's in half, so you only have 1 of this, then you most likely want to have an aerator. So a pump with some plastic tubing and an air stone in your tank, just to help make sure that there's enough circulation and oxygen going into your tank. If you have a filter like this that's 2 compartments, this is plenty to just circulate enough water in your tank that you don't need the aerator. So those are, depending on your setup, those are kind of the 2 most common ways. Because I know in our setup, we tend to do our tanks with the dual side, and then Portland Water District, some of your tanks are just singles. So it's kind of like whatever you have, just adapt. Because it doesn't really matter either way. You just want to make sure that if you have a single, you have an aerator. If you have double, you don't need one.
Is it bad if you have an aerator and the double? Because that's what we had last year.
No, it's just kind of overkill.
It's just overkill.
Yeah. It's basically just like more things to have plugged in.
Yeah.
So for most teachers, trying to plug in the filter and the chiller is like 2 outlets too many. So that's why you don't need to have the aerator. But you can definitely, if you want to. I would just make sure that the aerator, if you have a big filter like this, that the aerator and the filter are kind of together, because then you can have like a calmer side of the tank so that your eggs or your fish aren't always being bombarded with bubbles and current. So, all right.
A couple of the parts that you don't have here with us, though. I would probably have like a 5-gallon bucket,
Yes.
because the 5-gallon bucket will help dechlorinate the water. So you just fill up a bucket, leave it uncovered, have it sit out just so it dechlorinates, and then have some empty gallon jugs that you can then fill that water with and refrigerate it. So when
Or
you get
put it outside.
or put it outside unless it's 50 degrees out.
Right.
So.
Then it's not. Yes.
And those are things that we're gonna, I'll remind you next week that you'll probably wanna start doing
Right.
this stuff like next week.
Yes.
So making sure the chiller's working and getting the water cold, making sure your filter's working.
You're
Sorry.
stealing my thunder. No, I'm kidding. Just means that the training has worked.
Okay.
Yes. So as Chris was mentioning, once you've checked all of your pieces and that you have everything, next week what you want to do is you want to set up your tank. So you want to select a place in your classroom that is far away from your heating source on a very sturdy table, because once this is fully set up and filled with water, it's going to be like 200, 300 pounds. So you're not moving it once it's kind of in place. So make sure that it's near an electrical outlet, far away from a heating source. If you can get it kind of far away from the windows, also good. In a quiet part of your classroom, if you can manage that. And then just somewhere where you have like the space for this amount of material, because you do need to have your chiller facing so that your vents are facing out. So they can't be right up against a wall or like a filing cabinet or bookshelf or something, because you need to have airflow going all around so that it doesn't, like this should ideally be a little bit further away from the tank so that it has good air circulation all the way around, won't overheat. The heat from this won't transfer to your tank, and it's going to run efficiently. So you need to have that airflow as well. So yes, once you have it in place and you have triple checked that you have your insulation on the bottom of your tank, then you want to make sure that, well, I would recommend filling the tank with water and then putting your filter and chiller and everything kind of in, because as you're pouring your buckets of water, this is all going to get knocked around and everything like that. So you want to, before you start filling it with water, you want to do a visual inspection that there's not any dirt, grit, like there's stuff in here currently. So you'd want to take a damp cloth that has no soap, no chemicals, no nothing, and like wipe everything down. You want to make sure that your hands and arms have no lotions, hand sanitizers, soaps, anything like that. So just like triple rinse your hands underwater, and then you can get started like filling your tank with water. It typically takes like 5 to 6 5-gallon buckets, just because you're not filling it all the way to the top and you need to be able to lift it to pour. And then you want to basically pour until you're like right below this black part of your tank, because you want your chiller to be fully submerged in the water, and you also want your like filter to basically be like, this is like right at the water surface, so there's not a lot of splashing and things going on.
So I did this for the first time last year
Yes.
in my class, and I actually got all of the eggs put in my tank because the other teacher's tank wasn't ready yet.
Yep.
And they died, like they all died within like 3 or 4 days.
Yep.
And I'm just trying to figure out like what happened. I guess a lot of things could have happened, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I let it sit for a whole week, because you're supposed to do that, right?
Yeah, so the key things, or the reason why you want to set it up so far ahead of time is, one, so anything in the water can evaporate off, and you have a chance to do a chem check, so you can check the pH check for ammonia or anything else that you might have in your water. And then you also know that it's at the temperature that you want. So you want your tank to be around like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And so if your tank is having trouble getting that temperature, it takes a while for this chiller to cool all of this down. So you want to give it plenty of time to acclimate, and you also want to give it plenty of time for, if your chiller is not reaching the right temperature, to futz with it and to try to get it to the right temperature before your eggs arrive. You also want to be checking to make sure that your chiller is not icing up in your tank and other things like that. So yes, you want to have this set up like a week and a half before your eggs are going to arrive. And Chris went to, and did you go to the hatchery too? No. Okay, so you went to the hatchery, and the hatchery said that because the water, it's been fairly warm this winter, that the eggs are probably going to be ready sooner. So that means that we want to have our tanks set up as soon as possible, because they might be calling us the end of January being like, come get your eggs. And we're like, okay. So having your tank set up early lets you do all of those quality control checks and just make sure everything's good to go.
Is there any way that like we were worried that the water from our faucets are just is just bad because
Yeah.
we have it's a really really old school.
Yep.
And we have a someone in the elementary school that does salmon
Yep.
raising, and she just brings in all of her own water
Yeah.
for fear of that water being bad. So
Yeah. I mean, you could definitely just take like a beaker of water from your taps at school and just run it through whatever chemistry, like Lamont kits or whatever you have at your disposal, and just check it to see what it is. So you want it to be a pH of around 7. You don't want it to have, I don't know if we give any units for ammonia, but you don't want a lot.
yeah.
And then you could check to see if there's, I don't know, what could possibly be.
How about lead?
So lead could be an issue, but we've been raising these trout in like most schools that are fairly old, and it seems to be fine because we'll have a similar to what you had of like multiple tanks in a school. One tank will be totally fine. One tank will have a couple die-offs, like a little bit more than what they should. Another tank will be completely wiped out. And we're like,
Yeah.
what gives? So every time we talk to the hatchery, they're like, sometimes you just get a bad batch, or like sometimes it's in the transport, or sometimes it's they didn't acclimate in your tank long enough before you put them in. Could be a whole host of things.
Do we test for the amount of chlorine?
So you shouldn't have any chlorine in it once it all like sits. So you could test it. You should be looking for nothing, which is another reason why you always want to have water in storage. So water that you're currently evaporating off, and then water that you're kind of ready, like chilled in a refrigerator, so that you can add it as needed to your tank. But yes, there shouldn't be any.
Because there's
So.
conditioner, right? That we add a little bit of conditioner.
You can.
Can.
You might, like, that's something that you need to test for to see if you need to add it or not.
Okay, so if we, because could that be harmful if you add conditioner? Is that's not?
I guess it depends on what kind of conditioner, because you could be affecting the pH, or you could be just impacting how hard or soft the water is. So,
I've only used that conditioner before with like betta fish, and we
Yeah.
haven't had time to distill the water.
Mm.
And then we're like, oh, we got a brand new fish, and we need to put it in something really quick. We just don't have time, so
Right.
that's when I use the conditioner.
right. Generally, you don't need to do the conditioner if your
Just
tank
like-
has been acclimating.
Okay.
So,
And salmon eggs are resilient. They're much more resilient than the trout eggs, so that may be too, just like Ali was saying.
Well,
which is-
they're resilient in some ways and more picky in others.
so it may
So,
just be a bad, like she said, a
Yeah.
bad batch.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Right.
because we did, last year, we had multiple schools where they had a 50% mortality rate within the first week and a half, 2 weeks.
Mm.
But when that happens, you can generally call up the hatchery and they'll have
Oh,
more
yeah, just another
eggs, and
batch.
so you can just
Yeah.
get another
Okay.
refill,
Cool.
basically. So as long as it happens before they start hatching, they're generally safe that you can kind of
Get more.
restock. Yeah.
Huh.
Of course, if every school has that issue, then there's not.
Right.
But if it's just like a couple tanks throughout the region, they generally have leftovers. So, all right. Let me figure out where I was in my little train of thought. So, yes, you start filling your tank with water. You let it air out, sit. You have your chiller running. You're making sure that it gets the temperature. When you're letting it sit like this, well, you first want to have it so that your lid is off, so that you just kind of like fill your tank with water, let it sit for a day or two, and just have the water evaporate off. And then you can plug in your chiller and have it start going. And then once your chiller is on, then you want to make sure that all of your insulation is on and like tightly wrapped and things like that, so that your chiller isn't working overtime. to do so. So you want to have all of the pieces of your insulation on, and then you want to have your pieces on, and then if your insulation pieces don't like fit super well, then you're going to want to use duct tape to kind of wrap it all together so that nothing's falling off, and so that there's good contact and there's not a whole lot of gaps and spaces for like temperature to, and for light to get in. But the thing is, when you go to then take your panels off, just slit the corners, like slit the seams, and don't try to like pull the duct tape off, because then you can like rip your insulation and then you have to get a new piece for next year. And it's a pain in the butt to cut these over and over again. So just cut kind of like the corners. And then the other reason why we duct tape all of the edges is to help prevent insulation from like flaking into your tank. So if you don't have your edges wrapped, go ahead and wrap those, because it will make it easier and less messy. The other thing that you want to make sure is on your front panel, you want to have little cutout windows that you can then see into the tank. So this is another alternative if you don't want to do the like take them out of the tank and put them in the beaker. You can use these little cutout windows to make observations. It is a little bit harder because the tank's going to be dark with the top panel on, but you want to have at least one panel where you can read your thermometer. So once you have your tank filled with water, and you have your chiller and your filter in, you want to take your thermometer and kind of like put it in your tank wherever your window is. So let's say right there, so that when you take the window out, you can read your thermometer. And then that's a really easy way to kind of keep track of what your actual tank temperature is versus what your chiller is trying to achieve. And then that's something you always want to go off of the thermometer in your tank, not whatever your chiller says it's supposed to be. So those are the key things in terms of the setup. For your chiller, to set this up, one, you're going to need an extension cord because they give you a foot of cable. You want to make sure that your extension cord is 3-pronged and that it's like an outdoor waterproof extension cord, because this can get wet. So you just want to make a safe environment in your classroom. And then when you go to set it up, you basically want to just go through the controls to find the temperature, so you can have it set to either Celsius or Fahrenheit. And then once you have it set to the right temperature, or the right temperature that you want it to be, then you can set it to like the temperature range that you want your tank to be at. So if it's Celsius, you want to tell your chiller to go to 3 degrees, and then you want 1 degree of temperature differential. And that's 1 degree Celsius. So that means that your chiller is going to be working to get your tank to 3 degrees, and then it will turn off. And then it will wait until your tank reaches 4 degrees, and then it will turn back on and chill it back down to 3 degrees. So if you set your temperature differential to something more than that, then it's going to heat up more before it starts going back to chill. So that's why you want to make sure that your chiller is set up that way kind of to start, and then check to see what's going on in your actual tank. And then if you're telling your chiller to be at 3, but your tank is reading 5, then you know to knock your chiller down to colder until you reach the desired temperature in your tank. But when you're messing around with your chiller, you want to make sure that whatever temperature you're telling it to go to here is not going to start your like your coils in the tank to start icing up. So those are the things that you need to check as you're kind of playing with things before your trout get here. All right.
How big is the tank?
It's 30 gallons. Or I should say, ours are 30 gallons. I think almost all of yours are also 30 gallons. So,
bigger.
those are all of the key things, key pieces, setup, things like that. So once you have your tank at the proper temperature, you know the water has like evaporated off, you've checked the chemistry, everything's looking good, then you're basically just in standby mode for us to send out the call, email of like, the eggs are ready, we're coming today, or coming tomorrow. And then once we get the eggs to your classroom, you're going to want to put the water bottle that the eggs are going to come in, you're gonna wanna put them in your tank and just kind of have them float in the water bottle in your tank for an hour so that they can slowly start to acclimate to the conditions in your tank. Because they might be a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer at the hatchery. If there's like a significant, like something weird's going on at the hatchery where like all of the water that's been coming in has been crazy warm because of this winter, then we might have you start at a warmer temperature. The hatchery will tell us if we need to like deviate from the plan. But we basically just don't want to shock your trout eggs as they go in. So have them float around in the water bottle. Try not to have them float up right against the coils, so then they can get burnt. So just kind of have them float around. Some people like use their net to just kind of like corral and just have it hanging out, and then the insulation just kind of lays on top. You can get creative with it. And then once it's been in here for an hour, then you just take the cap off, and again, make sure you don't have any lotion, hand sanitizer, you haven't washed your hands with soap, your hands are like good, or you put some gloves on and you like release, you have the water bottle like down towards the bottom of your tank, and you have them just kind of flow out of the bottom of the water bottle there. You don't want them like falling from this height and just bouncing. So, and then once the eggs are in your tank and good to go, then it's switching to kind of doing this checklist. So that's when you're focusing on right temperature, your chiller's functioning, no ice, there's nothing floating in the water and like nothing like that, that your filter's running, all of that stuff. And then if there are any eggs that die, and you'll know an egg has died because it's going to turn like cloudy white. So just take it out with your net or whatever you have, and just compost it, throw it in the trash, whatever. And then just keep going until they decide to hatch, basically. So your eggs might hatch all at once, and when I say all at once, I mean within a series of like a couple days, or they might hatch over a couple weeks. You might have a couple eggs that hatch and then nothing. And then you might have a couple more eggs that hatch and then nothing. And then you might have a couple more eggs that hatch and then nothing. And then you might have all of them hatch. It will be a window that kind of varies based on your tank conditions and whatever was happening to the hatchery that we don't know about. Last year, a lot of them hatched really, really early. It happens. But as they hatch, their like eggshell will dissolve, and that releases a lot of ammonia into your tank. So if you notice that you start to have your eggs hatching, you need to start looking at the clarity of your water. And if you notice that your tank starts to get really cloudy, or your trout are like mostly or all hatched, that's when you want to do a 25% tank water replacement. So anytime your tank gets cloudy, or once your eggs have hatched, you want to take that water that you have in reserve, so the water that you've aired out and have chilled down to a cold temperature. You want to remove like the top quarter of your tank and just put it down the drain, and then refill it with your new fresh water. And then if your tank is still cloudy after that, in like a week or two, you can do that again. And then you should be good for like most of the rest of the unit. So you don't have to swap your water too much, but you might occasionally need to top it off because water will evaporate off your tank. So you just want to make sure that your water level is kind of kept high so that your chiller is always underwater and that, you know, there aren't any issues with your filter system. So, hatched. Then those are kind of all of the things. And then kind of in February, March, you want to pick, if you haven't already, you want to pick your like field trip release day. So all of you should already have your field trip release site or your release site. And that release site needs to be approved by Inland Fish and Wildlife, by the hatchery first, to make sure it's not going to mess with any native brook trout populations, or you're not putting it in a stream where the trout are not going to have a chance. So you want to pick your release day, and then you want to kind of start doing a calculation for when you want to have, so from your field trip, you want to kind of back calculate. So on your field trip day, you know that your tank temperature needs to be around 11 or 12 degrees Celsius. So that's going to hopefully closely match what your stream temperature is going to be, where they're being released. And then you want to kind of like back calculate so that every 4-ish days you are increasing, well, going from your field trip, you're decreasing, but you're basically changing the degree by 1. So every 4-ish days, you're kind of like changing it back until you reach the temperature that your tank is currently at. So if your tank starts at 4 degrees, you need to go from 12 back to 4. I recommend that you pay attention to your weekends and your April vacation, because you most likely will need to do a temperature change either on a weekend or on April vacation if you're just doing it strictly like 4 days at a time. So if that's the case, try to either do like 3 days and then 4 days of a temperature change, or try to have your temperature, if you can't get into your school or anything, try to have your temperature just stay consistent over April vacation. And then change it to like every 3 days, you're increasing the temperature. It really depends on when your release day is. And then you kind of go from there. And then the other thing is, so on this Excel spreadsheet, there's a digital form. So like it will help, you can kind of like set up your own calendar based on your field trip day. And then you also want to make notes of when you start removing your pieces of insulation around the tank. So the insulation removal is again kind of like every 5-ish days, because you basically want to have it so that all of your fish have hatched and they're all looking fairly developed. And if some of them kind of start swimming kind of towards the middle of the tank, that's when you know that they're kind of starting to look for sunlight and things, like they're not just lying on the bottom just eating their yolk sac. So once they start kind of like moving around, then you can look at your temperature and kind of where your field trip day is. And so you want to make sure that you have all of your primary pieces of insulation. So sometimes this back piece of insulation is really hard to take off. So you want to focus on your two side pieces, the front piece and the top piece, as the ones that you're removing before your field trip day. So that means that you start with kind of one of your smaller pieces as the first one that you take away. So you take away this one next, and then you can take away the front one or the top one, and then the last one is the one that you kind of take away a day or two before your field trip, just so that they're gradually getting exposed to more and more light as they're getting closer to going into the stream. So I think that's everything. So now for the release supplies, what you need is, if you are just taking the fish to the stream yourself and just doing a release like that, then you don't need to have very many supplies. You basically just need to have your fish in a cooler. We recommend like the Gatorade drink coolers or like something to that effect. And just make sure, again, it hasn't had any chemicals or like soap or anything like that. So we recommend having like a designated fish one, because also once you put fish in it, you never truly lose that fishy smell. So it's not something that you should like swap with gym or like athletics. Should put in big words like trout cooler. And then you want to have plenty of water from your tank go into that cooler, and then you want to make sure that you remove every single last trout from your tank. We have had to do rescues before, and it's not fun. So then you also want to have like ice, either ice cubes or ice blocks or something. Like you can buy bagged ice as well. It doesn't have to be like homemade. But you want to make sure that that ice is double bagged in like a Ziploc or a very secure sealed bag, so that it doesn't leak any whatever is in that iced water into your trout water. But you want to have ice in there to help keep it that colder temperature. And then if you're just doing a release by yourself, you just get to your site, and then you just kind of take the cooler. I recommend having like a smaller container that you can then scoop from the bigger one, and then you just want to like put that smaller container into the stream so the fish can just swim out. And then you just do that until all of your fish are done. If you are doing it with your students, then there's lots more to do. So you need to first make sure that your trout release site has ample space for your bus to kind of like drop everybody off safely. You want to have generally at least 3 stations for the students to kind of cycle through as you're kind of prepping things behind the scenes, also so that they get more familiar with where their trout are going. So that means having like a macro sampling site for them to look at the macros at the stream where their trout are being released to, having a water chemistry site or maybe a couple water chemistry sites where they're testing things like pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen, clarity, other things if you want to add them. But they're kind of checking those conditions to make sure that they're good for the trout. And then you want to do like a site assessment or a human impact for the site. So have them look around to be like, is there enough tree cover for the trout? Is there lots of woody debris in the stream? Are there pools, runs, riffles? Is the bottom sandy, or are there lots of rocks? Are there lots of hiding places? Are there lots of places for their macros and food to be? Are there other bigger fish that are possibly going to eat them? And then you also want to have them look around and see if there are signs of water pollution. So a lot of these release sites will be near roads or along hiking trails, and so there might be lots of litter or dog waste, or there could be road salt or car oil from the roads. There could be erosion at the site. You could talk about If there's a lot of development nearby, could there possibly be pesticides and fertilizers coming off that area? It all kind of depends on where your release is, but there are definitely a lot of things that they should be looking for. And then you also want to have them at some station record things like the weather, the temperature, the general science observations. And then while those students are kind of rotating through those stations, you can have either some chaperones or some additional teachers that are helping get a couple trout into small like Dixie cups for release. And so depending on how many students you have and how many fish made it to the end, you should aim for like 3 to 4 fish per cup generally. Depends again on how many tanks you have versus how many students, your survival rate, but generally that's what most classes and most schools end up with. And then you want to have the students do them in small groups. So you definitely want to have at least one teacher or chaperone in like hip waders or chest waders to be standing in the stream to just help make sure that everybody's doing things correctly, or at the very least like tall boots. It really depends on your site. Some of the sites are very shallow and you're fine with boots. Other ones, it gets deep quite quickly. But that just helps with safety and things like that. And then you want to have like groups of 5-ish students kind of walk up to the stream edge and remind them to like very gently put the cup into the water and have the fish swim out of their cup. So if they're pointing the cup into the current, they're going to be standing there forever. So you have to remind them to kind of have the cup at like a 90-degree angle to the current so that the fish can kind of safely swim out and leave, or have it pointing downstream so that the fish can leave. And then have them like slowly remove the cup and just verify that there's no more fish hanging out. And then kind of have them go to the bus or the end of the line or wherever your group is. And then that's kind of how you do a trout release. You can have, depending on your class size and how many classes you're doing this with, you might want to do 2 releases or multiple releases. So you might want to have like 1 or 2 classes go and do a morning shift, and then another 2 classes, like those classes go back on the bus, and then the bus brings another group, and you do an afternoon shift, because a trout release typically takes between 2 to 3 hours. So it is feasible that you can do 2 a day. It all depends on how far away your release site is from your school and how good your buses are. So that's the release. And then after you're done with the release and your tank is empty of fish, cannot emphasize enough how important it is to make sure you have every fish out of your tank. Because if the kids get back and you see fish still in the tank, they're going to be devastated. So then you want to, or I guess when you go to release your fish, so you're taking all the fish out and you've made sure that they're all gone, at that point, you can either choose to completely empty your tank and like turn off your filter and chiller at that time, or if you're like in a rush because you're like, I gotta just get the fish out and then we gotta get on the bus, make sure that there's at least enough water in the tank for things to still operate, or unplug your filter and your chiller and just worry about draining the tank afterwards. But again, if you don't completely drain the tank before you get on the bus, you really have to check that there's nothing left in here. So yes,
So,
go ahead.
so how quickly do you, like, are you using the net to put the trout in the cooler?
Yeah,
And-
or
and
like
you're-
a beaker or something
Right.
to kind of just scoop.
And you're using the net to put it in the beaker whenever you do the observation as well?
It kind of depends on where they are in their life stage. So like if they're in egg stage, like eye to egg, then yeah, you're gonna want to use a net to just kind of like fluff the water a little bit, so a couple kind of come off the bottom of the tank, and then you just kind of catch them in the net, and then you can put them in the beaker really easily. It helps if you kind of can like have the beaker in the tank, so you can kind of like have them kind of float out into that instead of like having it out in the air, and then you're kind of like that.
What about like,
But once they start moving and they have like their yolk, and they start moving, you can catch them in the net, or once they kind of start swimming around, you can just kind of scoop a couple. So, but they don't start really, really swimming until they're pretty much ready to be released. So most of your fish are going to be doing like, once they've hatched and they have their yolk, they're going to either just be chilling on the bottom of your tank, or they're going to be doing like very slow, casual movements around the bottom. Once, as they deplete their yolk sac, they're going to be growing more of their fins and like be able to have more muscle and like ability to move. And so then they're going to start to be more mobile. But they shouldn't be frantically swimming around, because then they're depleting their yolk sac instead of building their bodies. So they don't really start moving until they've completely depleted their yolk sac and they're ready to go in the stream, because at that point, they're ready to start looking for their own food sources. But you don't want to feed them.
so how early can you put them into the cooler before the bus leaves? Or however you're gonna
Yeah.
do it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so, I mean, if your bus is leaving at like 9, you could start putting them in around 8. You just want to make sure that there's lots of water for them, or you're not putting multiple tanks into the same container, so they're not all using up the same oxygen in there. If you need to prep them a little bit earlier, if you have an aerator, just stick it in your cooler and have that run. With the bags of ice in there, there are like multiple ways that you can kind of get them out of the tank a little bit earlier, but it's definitely not something that you can do the night before. But yes, if you need to come in a little bit early and start like prepping things, that's totally fine. But you because they'll be at the site in the cooler for a couple hours as well. So the key thing that you need to remember is that you don't want them to be hanging out in that cooler all day.
Right.
So, let's see. Oh yes, so after your release, you want to make sure your chiller is off and everything's good to go. You want to empty out your filter, and probably just, you can either chuck the filter pieces then, or you can kind of save them if you're like, I need to remember to buy these for next year. But then just make sure you have all that. Empty out your tank, and then you can use, I think it's a 10-to-1. We have the like bleach solution that you can kind of like run around your tank at the very end, like once you're all done. To kind of just like wipe everything down. And then once that's done, since you won't be using your tank for another 6+ months, it's totally fine. Don't try to do the bleach solution at this point, because it's not enough time. But at the end of your trout unit, like this spring, you can definitely run it around with that, and then just wipe it down with some water and stuff too. Just to make sure it's ready to go for next time you need to use it. Question.
So we used our tank for this other unit where we made these little things that sank.
Yep.
And the kids made like all these little plastic things with like glue on it, and they
Yeah.
the tank got super dirty, but I cleaned it all out just like with water,
Yep.
like pretty thoroughly.
Yeah.
And then just left it.
Yeah.
So
That should be fine, as long as like none of the other experiments would have been releasing, like actively releasing like chemicals or anything, and you gave it like a really good rinsing, cleaning out.
yeah,
It
it was
should
just
be
like
fine.
glue and
Yeah.
tape and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, because like when you get these, they have like stuff taped to the tank, like labels and all that stuff. So like
Yeah.
it happens. Yeah. But if you had like soap as part of that experiment, I'd be like, definitely need to do a more thorough.
But a lot of like
Cleanse.
kids' hands in there.
Yeah,
So,
that happens.
yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, because you gave it a really good rinse and
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So, and it's had time to sit and like all that. But yes, when you or the students, so this is like a really important thing for all of you to individually figure out is like rules for your tank in the classroom. So like some teachers are like, I am the one who's going to be going into the tank, hands off for everybody else. Other teachers, if you know your students really well and you know you can trust them, then you can have them be more hands-on. It all depends on your group of kids for the year. But the key things, no matter what, is that they need to be respectful about the amount of light that goes into the tank, especially when it's supposed to be all covered. So you don't want them always going up and pulling out the windows or taking the lid off and being like, what are they doing? You also want them to be very quiet around the tank. So not shouting, screaming, loud stomping, things that would agitate the tank. And then, again, no lotions, hand sanitizer, soapy hands, like any of that stuff goes into the tank. So if you want your students, you can get like the long gloves that they can wear, or you can be like, if you're gonna go in the tank, triple rinse your hands underwater before touching, those kinds of things. So yeah, those are kind of like the good rules. Some teachers plaster them on the front, or they have it on the whiteboard that's behind the tank. Doesn't matter. You definitely want to talk to your facilities person about all of this so they know not to unplug anything. Some of them are going to get really into it and want to check on your tank all the time for you during vacations, and that's awesome. Others are like, this is your problem. Figure it out. But you want to make sure that they understand like what your tank setup is going to look like, what needs to be plugged in at all times, so that they're not accidentally unplugging something to run a vacuum around your classroom or like whatever. Or if the school loses power or something, they know to go check on it, or to be like, yeah, we lost power and your tank didn't have anything.
We just need to wrap up whatever we want to
Yes.
get on the recording so that
Okay.
Carrie
Yeah.
can.
I mean, those are all of the points. So I was just going to go to Q&A at this point. So are
Sure.
there any questions? That was a lot of information, I'm aware, but
Is all that information
Yes.
in here?
yes. So the this packet, the TroutKids guide, is like more information than you probably ever want to know about raising trout in your classroom. And then the Soil and Water Conservation District version is like the short, sweet, kind of like your everyday guide. And then if you have something weird, or you're like, oh, I don't know if this is right or normal, the answer is probably in here. 'Cause yeah, there's a lot of information here. And some of it
Predecessor
is said,
put all the detail in.
yes,
Okay,
some of it is
thank you.
said over and over again. There are a couple discrepancies between the two manuals, but that's mostly just because our tanks have slightly different setups. But for the most part, it's the same. The other thing is, in this manual, there are some other things that they recommend you track, like the TTUs and things like that. We found that those are not always good indications of your trout development stages and like how things should be progressing in your tank, and then it causes some undue stress and anxiety. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, because sometimes we also don't know what their TTUs are from the hatchery. So we're just kind of guessing as to where they're starting from, and then that just cascades to further bad information.
That's also like daily thermal units of like
Yeah.
the temperature every
Right.
day. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, there's your daily thermal units, and then there's your
On that
total.
adds to the T. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, yes, there's tons of information in here. Read this, have them next to your tank, saved on your computer, all of that stuff. And then remember to go through the Google Drive and look at the lessons to see if you want to add those in. A lot of these types of resources, so this printout, this spreadsheet that you can go in and modify, and like a bunch of other resources are also on that Google Drive. So just explore, and if you're like, wow, I'm really looking for something, chances are it's already there. But if there's something like really specific, feel free to reach out to Chris or Kirsten or me.
And what's your
We can
contact
help.
information?
Yes. So, business cards. And then there are some things that, like, we're gonna just defer to the hatchery about. So if there are like really weird things, then it might be faster for you to just directly contact the hatchery, or you can contact us and we'll just contact the hatchery. Some things that you can expect, you might have mutated fish in your tank. So you might have fish with 2 heads, or you might have a fish with 2 tails,
Yeah.
or like some other birth defect. And so those are really good opportunities to kind of talk to your students about why that happens. Do you think that fish is more or less likely to survive in the wild? Like, all of those things. So there are going to be a lot of kind of spontaneous learning experiences that are going to happen with your tank. You get to talk to your students about death and mortality and like circle of life, and how what happens in your tank may or may not be better or worse than what happens to them in the wild. The swim for your life game really hammers that concept home of like, most fish do not survive past. So it's just really helpful for them to be prepared for those types of things, so that when the first egg dies, they're not like, oh my god, we did something wrong. But it's also something that you want to keep track of, just because if you're like, we've been having like 10 plus eggs die a day all week, like I need to figure out what's going on in my tank, or like do some quality control, because you should not be having lots and lots of eggs dying regularly or having a mass die off all at once. That's generally an indication that either something's wrong with your tank or something was wrong with the eggs to like begin with.
So what's
So.
a good number? What's a good percentage before a freak out?
Well, it kind of like fluctuates depending on where they are in the process. So don't be alarmed if once your eggs get to your tank, if you have like several of them die kind of early on, just because they might have not have acclimated correctly, or like the travel was whatever. They were on the bottom of the water bottle. So you might have like a peak then, and then things should kind of settle off. And then you might have another kind of peak once they start to hatch, and then things should settle off again. And then it should be fine. So you should kind of just have like 2 little peaks, and then you'll have like a couple kind of randomly scattered throughout. There is like a mortality range in the manual, but that's like, if you're noticing day after day after day that you're having really high die-offs, you're like, no, we're not gonna make it to the end. But if it's just like a couple days and then things kind of like settle down again, then it's fine. But if you're like day after day, yeah.
So can this support 600 eggs hatched?
600 eggs.
That's how many we'll get, right?
So you generally get 300 eggs
Okay.
per tank.
I had 600 just because
Right.
Emily's wasn't ready.
Okay.
But we had like 400 die, or like 500.
Yeah.
And then by the end, we did have like 60 left.
Yeah. So that's way too many, or like way too many dying.
Right.
So like generally so if you have a 30-gallon tank, you're gonna get about 300 eggs. They don't count the eggs, they just weigh them, so it's like 301, 298, like whatever. But you're gonna have approximately 300 eggs, and you should have over 200 by the time you get to release.
Okay. So they're not eating anything, are
They're
they?
not eating anything other than their yolk.
And they're gonna be about this big?
No. They're gonna be about an inch. So, I mean, yeah. Because you can kind of control their development a little bit with your temperature. So, if you need them to develop slower, run a colder tank. If you need them to develop a little bit faster, then warmer tank. I don't mean that to like really like mess with them, but like if you need to have your release date towards the beginning of May, you want to have your tank like temperature increase schedule much earlier in the process. If you need to kind of get your trout to last closer to the middle or end of May, then you need to have your tank running really, really cold for a really long time. So, that's kind of how that works, because the colder temperature has them eating less of their yolk. So they grow a lot slower, and then as you like heat up the temperature, they start growing a lot faster. And so basically they will absorb all of their yolk sac, and once they've done that, they will have a mouth and all of their fins and everything. And then they'll start swimming up kind of to the top of your tank, and that's the indication that they're ready to go into the stream. And so you don't want to have them swimming up to the top of your tank and then be like, well, you need to last 4 more weeks in the tank, because they're not gonna. So you need to kind of make sure that you're timing things correctly, or if you notice that your trout are developing faster than you were expecting or faster than you're hoping for, then you need to figure out if you can flex your release date, or if you're like, okay, I guess I'm gonna need to do this release on my own and just video it or tell my students how great it was. It happens.
So, when you release them,
Yep.
you want to release them in a gravelly area if possible?
I mean,
Or,
you mean like at your site?
yeah.
I would say as long as there's like nearby areas, it's fine, because the like easiest way to release them is to kind of release them in a fairly shallow, calm area, and not, because then it's safer for your students, and they get to actually like see the fish go into the stream, whereas if you release them into a much deeper part of the stream, they disappear almost instantly, and the students are like, where'd they go?
So we can't release the students as well?
No,
Just,
no.
Are you going to film any of them?
Yes. So like our office has an underwater camera that we bring to all of our release sites that we like hold underwater as all the students are letting them go. So that's really cool for the students to watch afterwards. They're like, those are mine. We're like, how can you tell that's your hand? But yes, so basically you want to make sure that your release area has like a shallow, not really steep bank, so that they have easy walk up access to the stream, and then they can put them in the water, and then the trout can kind of swim around. Because a lot of the time, the stream that you're releasing to, the current's going to be a little bit stronger than what was in your tank, and they're going to be like, whoa, cannot move. So a lot of them will just sit there, figuring out how to swim against the current.
Pop in for just a
Yeah,
second.
yeah, yeah.
So anyone that's on the live stream, we're gonna end that at this point, but we're gonna keep recording.
Cool.
So any questions that come up, we can still keep asking questions, but folks that are live streaming, just check back for the recording once we get it posted for additional questions.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay. Additional questions? Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm sure I'll have more as we start going, but
Yes, that is generally how that goes. So I guess my best advice for all of you is to just read all of these materials, get really familiar with them so that you feel comfortable with like how things are going to progress, the approximate timeline, time frame for things. And then know that you have all of us as resources, and enjoy it. Like, this is a really fun project for your students and for you. So make sure that you enjoy it and that you're having fun with it.
So you had said,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
you had said something at the beginning
Yep.
about renting, so like, I have, like 50-gallon fish tanks at the school that haven't been
Yep.
used in a while, and we have a chiller and checked that it works, but I don't know that it works to 3 to 4 degrees.
Yep.
So, is there equipment that I can rent from you if needed?
So our equipment has been reserved by other schools at this point,
Okay,
but like in other years, yes.
okay.
So we kind of just like every year, we're just like, does the teacher want to use this? We try to have our tanks available for teachers that want to try it,
Yep,
so that they can try it without having to like front the expense. Because these chillers are over $1,000 now. So like that's a lot for a teacher to just be like, haha, I can just buy this, and then if I hate the unit, oh well. So we have our equipment available for a teacher to try out, and then if they like it, we help them find the funding to buy their own kit. So
Thank you so much.
nice meeting you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
we'll be in touch.
We will be in touch for sure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
so how long does it take, like, if I need to order a chiller, because mine won't get it to the proper temp, like, how long does it take to get one?
So these chillers you have to order in September,
Uh-huh,
and they only do one order a year.
okay.
So
Is that
this-
this link here?
The Glacier,
Yeah,
yeah. So for these chillers, you want to order them in September, and then they start building them, and then they ship them in like December to the schools, or like
Okay.
November, December.
because I don't think we've had any contact, like, I've had contact with, Kirsten,
Yep.
but I'm, like, my district is like half in and half out, so it's kind of like,
Yes.
doesn't qualify, so,
So I guess the key thing would be to put some water in your tank, or like fill a bucket that's gonna hold this, and then just see what your chiller that you have can do.
so what is that, right there?
This is the coil. So this chills the water. So there's,
Okay. Because my chiller, I can tell you right now, it works, but it's definitely much smaller, so I don't
so like
know.
this is the part that gets submerged in the tank, and then it has this insulated cable that goes into the chiller, that like transmits the temperature.
Right.
So
It's a 50, like, the tanks are 55 gallons, so it'll take even that much longer. Can I use
Right.
distilled
So-
water instead of tap water to, get rid of the chemicals?
yes, you could absolutely buy water, but that's not gonna address the temperature issue.
No, I know
Right.
that part,
Yes.
I was just wondering
So,
if that's a possibility.
yes, you can absolutely buy. It's gonna be expensive, slash you're gonna have to buy a lot of it, but you
get
can.
100 gallons
Yeah.
from Poland Spring each year, so
Gotcha.
that will at
Yeah.
least get some of it
Yeah.
that hasn't been used,
Yeah.
but that takes a while too, because some of it's used for labs and experimentation.
Yes.
So because the other thing was
So
like,
there
I need to
are-
go pick up the
Yep.
eggs myself, right?
Yep.
Because there's no support from you guys because of where I'm at.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the number to the hatchery or the contact person?
We can,
Yeah,
you
we'll
can be
send
in,
that to you.
yeah, you can be in touch
Okay.
with me, and I can help you get set up that way.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I would say
So
for
I'm gonna
the-
stop because since we're
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of specific at this
Yeah.
point, I'm gonna stop the recording.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining.
Sorry, I don't wanna kill them.